In speaking upon the great and polarizing figure of RENE Girard, I aim to accomplish three things. First, I offer a brief intro to his life and work. Second, I want to suggest that, from beginning to end, Girard is an apocalypticist, and reading him through this lens offers the Ariadne thread which allows us to be guided through this polymath's expansive, diverse, and complicated oeuvre. Third, I want to argue that one of the central things that Girard gifts us is a visionary and dramatic Christian philosophy of history, which allows us to situate ourselves in our own time with a new-found urgency, which calls us to personal sanctity. The latter is why I conclude my reflections with his final and arguably his most controversial text, Battling to the End. In this text, he calls Christians to a radical life of imitation of Christ amidst a world whose violence is barreling towards an escalation to extremes, and Christianity itself is experiencing its own failure foretold in the canonical apocalyptic texts. RENE Girard was born 1923 on the evening of Christmas Day, his place of birth being the historically famous and infamous Avignon, given its troubled papal past. Girard's father, Joseph Girard, was the curator of the magnificent palace of the popes, as well as an archivist paleographer. His father's religious stance was a rather typical one, anti-clerical and republican. On the other hand, his mother, Maria Thérèse de Loy-Fabre, was a committed Catholic from a reasonably well-born aristocratic family, one that was in danger of persecution during the French Revolution. Girard says, "I was raised in the double religion of Dreyfusism and Catholicism on my mother's side, although I didn't learn about Péguy until much later." From an early age, Girard exhibited a strong dislike of school and institutions, so much so that his mother withdrew him from school and taught him at home. As the wonderful biographer of Girard, Cynthia Haven, notes, at a young age, he showed a lifelong penchant for taking his own path, a solitary education, formed by his own enthusiasm and intuitions. Girard had an exceptionally happy childhood, attesting to the feeling of belonging to his childhood and his books, notably his abridged version of Don Quixote and Kipling's Jungle Book. Girard was the second of 5 children and the sickly one, being saved from serious illness on more than one occasion, one of which was typhoid fever. As an adolescent, when he returned to school after what he called his school for the spoiled, he became less disciplined and dedicated to his studies. The pubescent RENE was something of a prankster, a rabble-rouser, often in detention. But as Haven notes, despite being a precocious and mischievous youth, when looking at his marks, one still sees a gifted student, not entirely disengaged from his studies. In June 1940, France surrendered to Germany in what has been termed France's strange defeat. This event would cast a long shadow over Girard's life, and it is no accident that he returns to the world historical nature of Franco-German relations in his final work, Battling to the End. Girard received his General Baccalaureate in 1940 and his one in philosophy in 1941. The latter he passed with distinction. Both father and son were immensely pleased. However, his university future was opaque. Girard's desire was to take the entrance exam for the École Normale, so he went to Lyon at the commencement of the occupation to prepare for his entrance exam. The diet was poor and there was student hazing. Girard relates that his old fear of schools resurfaced. He told his mother it was impossible for him to continue, and he returned home a few weeks later. With this return, the possibility of attending France's finest institution vanished. His father suggested that he prep for entrance into the École des Chartes. He accepted this suggestion with relish, as he was able to stay in Provence, which at that time was still a free zone, staying on with his family for an extra year. In November 1942, German occupation extended over southern France. Girard studied at this école from 1943 to 1947. He described this time as unequivocally the worst experience in my life. The war, the occupying presence of the Germans, his unheated room, along with his experience as a southern outlier, made him detest Paris. As he attests, if it wasn't for the occupation and the difficulty of returning home, he never would have finished his studies. During these years, sickness returned and his studies were often interrupted. His poor health also prevented military service. In 1946, he would return to Avignon and, like his father, write a dissertation on his hometown. As Girard related to Haven, his training was essentially as a librarian. His degree, like his father's, was that of an archivist paleographer, a degree from a school dedicated to the most technical aspects of French medieval studies. Haven astutely remarks that it was in these years that Girard first began to learn his vocation, which would, through a close reading of texts, dig into the archives of human history, a history filled with desirous violence. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed at Normandy. By August 25th, France was liberated. Shortly after his return home, he became a founding figure of the world-famous Avignon Festival. Girard was a major player in aiding the launch of this festival in the summer of 1947. The festival was a triumph, gathering paintings from such geniuses as Picasso, Klee, Chagall, and Kandinsky, among others. But despite success, Girard's destiny was not in the world of art, nor was he destined to follow in his father's footsteps as an archivist. Further, on his own soil, due to his training, his possibilities were limited in the strict and choreographed French academic setting. The land of opportunity called him. Because of the GI Bill, America was looking abroad to help fill much-needed university position. Girard was offered two positions. The first was at the United Nations Library. The second was teaching French at Indiana University. He took the second, and in September 1947, he set sail on a 9-day journey on an ocean liner across the pond. There, he was required to do a PhD in history. At Indiana, Girard met the love of his life, Martha McClure. They were married on June 18, 1951, and would have 3 children together. In Indiana, he wrote his dissertation on American opinions on France, 1940 to 1943. At this time, Girard was a typical atheistic French intellectual, and one that was by no means set on intellectual fire or guided by a visionary intuition. Girard described himself at this time as more interested in girls and cars before he married Martha. So much so that Girard's lack of dedication to his academic craft resulted in his not receiving tenure due to having not published much, despite being a favorite among the students. In 1952, Girard was aided in getting a position as instructor at Duke University, followed by an assistant professorship at Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania. In 1953, where he would remain until 1957. That year, he took the position of associate professor of French at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. If Pindar is correct that we become who we are, then it was in Baltimore that Girard became Girard. Here the roots of his desire were disclosed to him, and he received the gift of his intellectual vocation, ever tied to his conversion to Christianity. For what are we without what we have received? Girard's religious conversion occurred while riding along the Pennsylvania Railroad, on way from Baltimore to his former institution, Bryn Mawr, for a class he taught once a week. This experience coincided with Girard's finishing of Deceit, Desire in the novel. He says, "In the autumn 1958, I was working on my book about the novel, on the 12th and last chapter that's entitled Conclusions. I was thinking about the analogies between religious conversion and the experience of the novelist, who discovers that he's been lying consistently, lying to himself for the benefit of his ego, which in fact is made up of nothing but 1,000 lies that have accumulated over a long period, sometimes built up over an entire lifetime." For Girard, conversion gives a special kind of knowledge about desire, which uncovers the lie that we are to ourselves. He goes on, "I was proud of being a skeptic. It was very hard for me to imagine myself going to church, praying, and so on. I was puffed up, full of what the old catechism used to call human respect. But this experience kept expanding, dilating, so much so that Haven states, the revelation became his work." Girard says, "Everything came to me at once in 1959. I felt that there was a sort of mass that I've penetrated little by little. Everything was there at the beginning, all together. That's why I don't have any doubts. There is no Girardian system. I'm teasing out a single, extremely dense insight." What Girard describes here is something remarkably close to Bergson's description of the simplicity of original intuition had by the great philosophers. But there is more to Girard's experience. It was certainly an intellectual conversion, as he himself attests, but it was likewise a conversion of the whole man. He says, "I remember quasi-mystical experiences on the train as I read, contemplated the scenery and so on. But my mental state transfigured everything, and on the way back, the slightest ray from the setting sun produced veritable ecstasies in me." The intellectual and quasi-mystical aspect of his conversion was given extreme weight and confirmation when one morning on the same railroad he discovered a disconcerting spot on his forehead. He was diagnosed with cancer, and the doctor did not tell him that it was easily curable. Girard thought the worst and that he was under the death sentence of melanoma. Girard was 35, and it was the Wednesday of Holy Week when he discovered that the cancer was gone. Girard's conversion was thus a death and resurrection experience of the whole man. He says, "So my intellectual conversion, which was a very comfortable experience, self-indulgent even, was totally changed. I could not but view the cancer and the period of intense anxiety as a warning and a kind of expiation, and now this conversion was transformed into something serious in which the aesthetic gave way to the religious." So not unlike Pascal's Night of Fire, Girard's life and work were given radical urgency. Girard and Martha renewed their wedding vows, and the children were baptized. Girard bravely moved ahead in his commitments to Christianity, despite what his growing fan club would think, and the stumbling block that Christianity was to become for his present and future theories. In 1961, the same year that Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Affinity was published, Deceit, Desire, and the novel appeared. In October 1966, Girard put on a conference at Johns Hopkins that still lives on in academic lore. the conference, titled "The Language of Criticism and the Science of Man," has been called a watershed, epochal, a major reorientation in literary studies, and the French invasion of America. The event was meant as a celebration of structuralism. Claude Lévi-Strauss was unable to attend in person, but gave his imprimatur for the event. But in many ways, the conference announced the end of the dominance of structuralism in France and heralded the ascendancy of post-structuralism and postmodernism. The symposium marked the first appearance in the US of the intellectual rock star Jacques Lacan, and it was clear that Lacan came with the intent of spreading his controversial psychoanalytic empire. Jean Hippolyte, Roland Barthes, and Lucien Goldman, amongst others, were all present, as was the rising star of the up-and-coming Derrida, just 36 years old then. This conference thus announced the arrival of deconstruction in the US and was the birth of its empire that would soon colonize many of the most prestigious literary departments in the US, along with more than a few philosophy departments. Girard would later say to Haven that he had brought La Peste to the US, likening it to a star thistle that has taken root across the US and is now impossible to eradicate. Girard said further, "When Freud came to the USA, he said, as he approached New York, 'I am bringing the plague to them.' But he was wrong. Americans digest it and Americanize psychoanalysis easily and quickly. But in 1966, we really brought the plague with Lacan and deconstructionism, at least in the universities." 2 years later, in 1968, Girard left Johns Hopkins, largely because he felt alienated by the trend of deconstruction that was taking over. He was appointed as distinguished professor at the State University of New York, Buffalo, in the English department. With the move to Buffalo, Girard somewhat dropped off the map, while also marking his turn from literature to anthropology. There, Girard pored over the magisterial giants of 19th and 20th century anthropology. Girard says, "When I moved from literature to anthropology, I did it totally on my own. During that period, I read more books than at any time before or after. I was mainly concerned about the religious and the sacrificial elements. As a matter of fact, I never stopped reading books from the viewpoint of sacrifice." According to Girard, these years were the most hyperactive period of my life I have known. At the end of the 1960s, when I alternated between elation and depression in the face of what I was trying to construct. The result would be the 1972 publication of Girard's groundbreaking work on human violence and sacrifice, Violence and the Sacred. With this controversial work, an intellectual star was born. Violence and the Sacred, although exceptionally original, could be read as another text by another brilliant French intellectual obsessed with violence and murder, for there are more than one. This is not to detract from the originality of the text, but it is to say in a roundabout way that this text was part of a larger ambition. Girard's initial hope was to make Violence and the Sacred a two-part book. The first part treating archaic religion and the second Christianity. Girard ended totally cutting the part on Christianity. He began work on Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World in 1971, even before the publication of Violence and the Sacred, a work he would finish in collaboration with Jean-Michel Ouglorion. In 1976, Girard returned to Johns Hopkins as the James M. Bell Professor of French and the Humanities. In 1978, his magnum opus, Things Hidden, appeared. Girard's Christianity was now fully in the open for all to see. This text was immensely controversial because its core concern was a special kind of anthropological revelation that Christ brings to humanity. In the first 6 months, the text sold 35,000 copies, making it second on France's nonfiction bestseller list. When the paperback came out, sales rose to 100,000. The Star Born with Violence and the Sacred continued to ascend in France. He credits much of his success to his publisher. He would appear on a famous French literary TV show, and the work was promoted by a prominent journalist and economist. This work, as Chris Fleming noted, incited intense discussion in the upper echelons of the French Academy. Fleming says, theorists such as Michel Serres, Paul Ricoeur, and Philippe Soler were all admirers of the work, and later other theorists such as the renowned Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo and the Canadian social and political theorist Charles Taylor expressed, and indeed continue to express, more than a token admiration for Girard's project. Yet the work was polarizing, and it marked a new era in Girard's thought. With Things Hidden, Girard drew the attention of the theologians. It is hard not to see Girard's Christianity as the cause for him not reaching the superstardom of a Derrida despite his tremendous success. So, Things Hidden spanned his time in Buffalo and was concluded on his second stint at Johns Hopkins. Martha says that Girard returned to Baltimore because he was restless. This restlessness would mark his second time at Johns Hopkins as short-lived. In 1979, he became a member of the American Academy of the Arts and the Sciences, and in 1981, he left the East Coast forever to become the inaugural Andrew B. Hammond Chair in French Language, Literature, and Civilization at Stanford University. Girard would remain at Stanford until the end of his days. The next 34 years of his life would see the publication of The Scapegoat, 1982, Job, The Victim of His People, 1987, A Theater of Envy, William Shakespeare, 1990, I See Satan Falling Like Lightning, 1999, The One by Whom Scandal Comes, 2001, and Battling to the End, 2007. The latter sold 20,000 copies in the first 3 months. He received multiple honorary degrees from such institutions as Innsbruck, Tübingen, and St. Andrews, to name 3. In 2005, he was inducted into the Académie Française, thereby becoming one of the immortals. And in the same year, the Mimetic Research Association was founded in Paris. In 1975, he became friends with the Innsbruck theologian Raymond Schwager. The result of this friendship was an extraordinary correspondence that lasted for over 30 years. One of the many fruits of their dialogue was a deepening of Girard's theological understanding of the mysteries of Christianity, not the least being Girard's later acceptance of Christ's sacrifice as expressed in the Epistle to the Hebrews. Initially, Girard only recognized the murderous meaning of sacrifice as he had defined it in archaic religion. But through Schwager's influence, he was able to see the Christian meaning of sacrifice, now understood as a radical expression of Christ's self-gift of love. He admitted that he was completely wrong and that he had scapegoated Hebrews. In 2007, he published with the renowned Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo an important dialogue entitled Christianity, Truth, and Weakening Faith. 2013 bestowed upon him the honor granted by King Juan Carlos of Spain of the award of the Order of Isabella the Catholic, given for his profound attachment to Spanish culture as a whole. On November 2015, he died peacefully in his sleep at his home on the Stanford campus after a series of strokes at the ripe and venerable age of 92. Girard was a veritable polymath, so how connect an imposing oeuvre that spans literary theory, anthropology, and ethnology, while also having deep philosophical and theological implications. Girard was a thinker of one intuition that follows from the imitative nature of human desire, which is then combined with an ambitious grand narrative, even a monocausal one, that explains how the very origin of religion, culture, and human history is rooted in a real sacrificial murder. Girard says, in effect, our most essential discovery is precisely the 0 hour of culture, which is also the hour of sacrifice, the founding sacrifice. My suggestion, impossible to fully argue here, is that in order to unite the many faces of Girard, one must read him as an apocalypticist. More than a few Girard interpreters do not know what to do with this last and most apocalyptic work, Battling to the End. It seems like something of an outlier, but in my interpretation, it is his crowning apocalyptic moment, but one among many. This apocalyptic thread commences in his very first text, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. It is no accident that from the very beginning, desire is read as apocalyptic, nor is it an accident that the penultimate chapter of the text is titled the Dostoevskian Apocalypse. Girard says, to perceive the metaphysical structure of desire is to foresee its catastrophic conclusion. Apocalypse means development. The Dostoevskian apocalypse is a development that ends in the destruction of what it has developed. Girard follows this intuition to the end, that is, all the way to battling to the end. And in a visionary manner, he elides this into his visionary and dramatic philosophy of history, which I will treat. It is further not happenstance that his too little known second book, Resurrection from the Underground, was on Dostoevsky. This superb little text is dappled with moments of apocalyptic vision. Girard's very reading of Dostoevsky is inherently apocalyptic. Girard contends that the underground metaphysics begun in Notes from the Underground, passing over to Demons, and concluding with Brothers Karamazov, must objectively end in demonology, counter to that of Christ. In The Possessed, he even discovers a demonic counter-trinity at work, all the way to the high point of the Grand Inquisitor's prostration before the other, Satan, in Brothers K. Indeed, in this work, the trope of Satan casting out Satan is already present, as it is well known that this later becomes one of Girard's favorite ways of describing the victimage mechanism. There are no overt apocalyptic moments in Violence and the Sacred, but this text was always leading towards things hidden, where Christ's revelation is literally apocalyptic in the sense of disclosing or unveiling the hidden workings of sacrificial violence. In this text, the battle between the violent Heraclitean logos and the peaceful Johannine logos of love is waged. Indeed, the text even claims that we are objectively in an apocalyptic situation because of humanity's possession of nuclear weapons makes total destruction possible. The irony of nuclear deterrence being that we are only protected from violence by the threatening hand of violence, the threat of total annihilation. In his next monograph, The Scapegoat, Girard's final chapter concludes with a provocative and embryonic account of a pneumatic apocalypse. Here the Holy Spirit is presented as working in history to uncover and vanquish satanic violence, thereby continuously unveiling the truth of Christ after his departure to the Father. The apocalyptic ante is upped in I See Satan Falling Like Lightning, where Girard meditates on the enigmatic Pauline theme of the katechon, along with powerful and pertinent ruminations on the Antichrist figure and this figure's usurpation of victimhood, now used in a hidden and subtle anti-Christian guise. There are also numerous interviews where Girard invokes eschatological and apocalyptic themes. To cite just one, in his interview with Haven called "Christianity Will Be Victorious Only in Defeat," Girard describes the apocalypse as a long, drawn-out spiritual stasis. In that same interview, he says, "The Antichrist doesn't seem to work by force, but I think you could see that it's a certain modern spirit, the spirit of power, the idea that man has become totally master of himself, and that he doesn't have to bow in front of powers greater than himself, and he's going to triumph in the end." If my suggestion that the Ariadne thread of Girard's work is apocalyptic is still unconvincing, Girard himself says as much in a 2007 filmed interview with the Hoover Institute titled "Insights with René Girard." There, Girard says, in the old liturgy, before the invention of the atomic bomb, that the Church used to read apocalyptic texts from the Synoptic Gospels. This was done at the liturgical times of Pentecost and Advent. As a child, Girard was deeply struck by these texts. He even says that they were the only interesting thing about the Church for him at that time. He tells us that the inspiration of his whole work was there and that he has been talking about these apocalyptic texts all along. Girard was an apocalypticist from beginning to end, and this is how we should interpretively unite the imposing corpus of our polymath.